Clint Eastwood, the national treasure of America, the indestructible mountain of Hollywood, the man who turned silence into strength, turned a gaze into legend, and carved his name into the history of cinema as an irreplaceable monument. For more than 7 decades, he has not only played heroes, but has become the living embodiment of resilient America, a man of solitude and silence, yet unyielding against the storms of time. From a poor boy of the Great Depression, he climbed to the peak of glory with calloused hands and an unbreakable will. Over 70 films, 4 Academy Awards, and hundreds of millions of hearts across the world have bowed before that steel gaze, the gaze of a true legend. No one else, only Clint Eastwood, the symbol of strength, determination, and immortal pride. His fortune is nothing short of astonishing. More than $400 million in net worth, along with a collection of prestigious estates spread across the United States. From the magnificent Mission Ranch Inn in Carmel by the Sea, which he personally restored from ruins, to Tehama Golf Club, a private paradise worth tens of millions nestled in the windswept hills of California. Vast ranches spanning thousands of acres in Northern California, luxurious residences in Bel Air, Sun Valley, and Idaho. Each stands as a landmark of power, a declaration of freedom, and a stature no one can rival. He is neither wasteful nor ostentatious, yet every acre of land, every brick, reflects the class of a man who mastered his own destiny. No one in Hollywood has built a legacy as enduring as his, an empire of discipline, of freedom, and of silence. But behind that brilliance lies an enormous price that only time can comprehend. He is the father of 8 children by 6 different women, a family stretching across generations, each child a piece of his turbulent journey. Fame brought him glory, but also stole his peace. He has everything: wealth, power, legend, yet he lost many things that could never be bought back: time, love, and the years beside those he cherished most. Let us walk through his life of glory and storms, through the arduous and tireless journey that built his fortune, and see what he has left behind for his children and for the world. Before we begin, if you have ever known or admired Clint Eastwood, don't forget to hit the like button. Your small gesture is a powerful tribute to an extraordinary and legendary talent. Before Clint Eastwood became Hollywood's last real cowboy, he was a forgotten child of America's hardest years. A boy born not into privilege, but into motion, cold, and uncertainty, where even a roof was borrowed and every meal was a question. He entered the world on May 31, 1930, in San Francisco, as the Great Depression tore across the country, stealing jobs, homes, and hope itself. He weighed 11 pounds at birth, so enormous that nurses nicknamed him Samson. But strength for Clint wasn't a gift, it was a demand. His father, Clinton Eastwood Sr., a steelworker proud but powerless, watched factory gates close one after another, each layoff tightening the noose around the family's survival. His mother, Ruth Runner Eastwood, strong-willed and disciplined, held the family together through sheer resolve. Love in their home wasn't loud. It was a quiet endurance, stretched thin through whispered arguments in the night. Clint would later recall, "You could hear everything in those walls, especially the sounds that hurt." By the time he turned 10, Clint had lived in more than a dozen towns up and down the West Coast, from the dusty plains of Sacramento to the fog-heavy hills of Oakland. Every move meant starting over. New school, new faces, new shame. Those weren't just addresses, he said later. They were uprootings. Some nights, when money ran out, the Eastwoods slept in their car parked under flickering streetlights. Ruth wrapped his baby sister Jean in her coat, while Clint pressed his back to the car door, blocking the draft. The windows fogged with their breath. The cold bit through the thin wool blankets. His stomach growled louder than the rain, but no one spoke of hunger. Silence was cheaper. Through the windshield, he'd watch the world blur by in wet streaks of yellow and gray, wondering if any of those glowing houses ever stayed in one place. Inside that silence, he learned to read his parents' fear like weather. His father's long stare at the table, his mother's voice trembling under control. Those were the storms of his childhood. They didn't fight much, he remembered, but sometimes the quiet was worse than shouting. He learned to make himself smaller, to breathe softly so the tension wouldn't notice him. And in that stillness, the blueprint of his future was drawn. Control, endurance, and a belief that only what you build yourself can't be taken away. School was no refuge. Teachers called him restless, a word that hid the ache of never belonging. He was held back a grade, later expelled from Piedmont High for carving crude drawings into a desk, a small act of rebellion against a life that refused to stay still. It wasn't about trouble, he once said. It was about wanting control. Somewhere. Anywhere. That control came from an unlikely place. Music. At 12, he found a broken piano in a neighbor's garage and taught himself to play. He played until his fingers bled, the notes filling the air like something sacred. It was the first thing I ever owned that couldn't leave me, he said decades later. That battered piano became his first act of creation, proof that effort could build beauty, that discipline could tame chaos. That old piano, he said softly, was the only thing that made the cold feel smaller. By 15, Clint Eastwood had already learned truths most men spend a lifetime avoiding. That love can vanish, that security is borrowed, and that silence is safer than pleading. His mother's steel, his father's silence, the endless moving, they became the bricks of a wall he would later build around himself. When asked how he created those stoic, steel-eyed characters, the man with no name, Dirty Harry, he only smiled. "That wasn't acting," he said once. "That was remembering." And maybe that's why, when life finally gave him choices, he chose to build instead of run. He bought land. He restored what others abandoned. He turned instability into permanence, scarcity into empire. "I got tired of moving," he said in old age, "so I started building things that would never move again." Because before he was a legend, before the lights, the cameras, the gold statues, there was just a boy in the back seat of a cold car, staring out at a world that had everything he didn't, whispering a promise to himself. "One day, I'll stand still, and nothing will ever take it away again." He grew up learning that nothing in life was his to keep. Not a home, not safety, not even love. So when the ocean came for him at 21, Clint Eastwood met it the only way a man who had lost everything could, by refusing to let go again. That night of cold, chaos, and silence would carve his soul forever. It was 1951. He was just 21, a lean, untested kid serving as a swimming instructor in the U.S. Army at Fort Ord, California. He wasn't chasing fame yet, only a paycheck and a sense of direction. That weekend, he boarded a Navy aircraft bound for Seattle, a routine hop across the Pacific coastline. But routine can turn to catastrophe in the blink of an eye. Somewhere over Point Reyes, the engines sputtered, the cabin shook, and before anyone could pray or panic, The plane plunged into the dark ocean below. Metal screamed, waves swallowed, and in an instant, Clint Eastwood, future icon, future millionaire, future legend, was nothing but a body in the freezing Pacific, clinging to life with empty hands and borrowed breath. There were no lights, no signal, no rescue in sight, only the merciless rhythm of the waves. The cold was not just biting, it was consuming. Each stroke felt like lifting lead through ice. He swam mile after mile through black water that could have been his grave. "You can't think about distance," he would later say. "You just think about the next breath." For over 2 miles, maybe 3, he fought the sea's invisible weight, salt burning his throat, muscles locking in agony, his heartbeat slowing under the cold. Somewhere between fear and instinct, something shifted. He wasn't just fighting to live, he was refusing to disappear. When at last he crawled onto the jagged shore, trembling, soaked, and half-conscious, the world looked different. The stars above were no longer distant, they were witnesses. Every breath he took that night was borrowed time. Years later, Clint Eastwood would recall softly, "I realized how fast life could be taken away. I didn't want to waste a minute after that." That near-death night became the foundation of everything he would build. It taught him that survival was not noise, but focus. That time, not money, not fame, was the real currency of life. He carried that truth into every frame, every decision. On film sets, he was known for speed and precision, wrapping movies days or even weeks early. Crews called it discipline. Friends like Fritz Maines called it obsession. That crash never left him, Maines once said. He carried time like a weapon. He was always chasing purpose. And that purpose became his fortune. Every acre he bought, every film he directed, every empire he built was rooted in that single night. The night he learned the difference between surviving and living. When others hesitated, Clint moved. When others dreamed, he built. He didn't hoard wealth for vanity. He built permanence to defy impermanence. The sea didn't just test him, it branded him. The boy who once floated helpless in the dark became a man who vowed never to drift again. His characters, the lone riders, the silent protectors, the men of few words, all carried that echo of salt and survival. They weren't performances. They were reflections of the same soul that once crawled out of the Pacific with nothing but willpower left. "You learn that fear is temporary," he said once. "Regret is forever." Behind the myth, behind the rugged face and the Oscars, remains that same young man, cold, soaked, and alive, whispering to himself that time is the only thing worth owning. He carried that vow into every frame, every decision, every empire he built. A silent promise that nothing in his life would ever be left to chance again. The ocean had taken everything from him once, except the will to endure, and from that moment on, he built a world that could not be washed away. Long before Clint Eastwood became the man whose glare could silence a room, he was just another shadow on a studio backlot, tall, quiet, and nearly invisible. Hollywood in the early 1950s was a city that devoured dreamers. Behind every shining marquee were 100 broken men, and Clint could have easily been one of them. He arrived with no training, no connections, and barely enough money to keep a room. Some nights, dinner was nothing more than stale coffee and a half sandwich from the day before. When he couldn't afford gas, he slept in his car. One blanket, one dream, and a silence so deep it could break a lesser man. "I didn't have any connections," he once said. "Nobody gave me anything. I just stayed long enough for the others to quit. He took odd jobs, digging pools, stacking lumber, carrying props, anything to survive. Casting directors dismissed him again and again. Too stiff, too quiet, too serious. Hollywood wanted charm. Clint had gravity. While others talked their way into roles, he listened. He studied. He watched how light shaped faces, how pauses told more truth than dialogue. Patience, he later said, was my only currency. For nearly a decade, that was all he could spend. But that quiet endurance became his secret wealth. The kind of wealth that couldn't be stolen, only built. His first real break came not with applause, but persistence. In 1959, he landed a role in Rawhide, a supporting part meant to fill space. Yet something about his stillness drew the eye. He didn't speak much, but when he did, every word felt earned. By the show's second season, audiences weren't watching the hero. They were waiting for the sidekick to speak. That silence, the same one that once cost him everything, now made him unforgettable. Within years, Clint Eastwood became television's new face of strength. Lean, silent, magnetic. For the first time, he wasn't surviving Hollywood, he was shaping it. Then came fate, in the form of Italian director Sergio Leone. Clint nearly turned down a fistful of dollars because the script had so little dialogue. "Why would anyone care about a cowboy who doesn't speak?" he asked. But the silence felt like home, like memory. He took the part. The film was made on a shoestring budget, paying him only $15,000, but it earned over $20 million and changed cinema forever. With for a few dollars more, and the good, the bad, and the ugly, Clint Eastwood became a global icon. His face, half in shadow, half in sunlight, was no longer that of a struggling actor. It was the face of endurance itself. Yet even as the fame grew, so did the solitude. "I've always felt like an outsider," he admitted, "even when I was in the middle of everything." Hollywood's brightest star still carried the chill of that car seat, the echo of nights when success felt like a distant myth. He didn't chase the spotlight. He built it, piece by piece, out of the silence that had once defined him. That paradox, strength born from restraint, power born from pain, became the essence of every character he played. Dirty Harry wasn't fiction. The man with no name wasn't invention. They were reflections of the same boy who once whispered to himself in the dark, "Don't disappear." By the 1970s, Clint Eastwood had already climbed the impossible mountain: fame, money, power. To most men, that would have been enough. But for him, it wasn't. Freedom, not fame, was what he'd been chasing all along. "I just didn't want someone telling me how to feel anymore," he once said softly, a line that carried the weight of years spent under other people's control. He had been molded, directed, and packaged by Hollywood's machine, until he decided to build a machine of his own. That decision changed everything. With a few trusted friends and the savings from his television years, Clint founded Malpazzo Productions, a company small in name but seismic in purpose. It wasn't born from ambition, but rebellion. "I was tired of asking permission," he once told a friend. Malpazzo became the place where he could create without apology, fail without fear, and finally own what he made. His first project as director, Play Misty for Me, 1971, wasn't safe or commercial. It was haunting, intimate, the story of obsession and control, mirroring the very life he was trying to reclaim. Critics were divided. Clint didn't care. Approval was temporary. Ownership was forever. From that moment, he built not just films, he built foundations. His discipline became his wealth. While other directors drowned in ego and budgets, Clint worked like the blue-collar laborer he once was, quiet, efficient, precise. "Time is expensive," he said, "and I don't intend to waste either." He filmed in weeks, not months, and every dollar he saved went back into his next project. By the time Unforgiven premiered in 1992, Clint had stripped the Western of its myth and left only its bones: guilt, loss, redemption. The Academy crowned him with 2 Oscars, but the real victory wasn't gold, it was independence. That film grossed over $159 million worldwide, turning not only a profit, but a point. He didn't need Hollywood's permission to make masterpieces. Each movie that followed, The Bridges of Madison County, $1 Million Baby, $216 million worldwide, Gran Torino, $270 million, added bricks to the fortress he'd been quietly constructing all along. He poured his earnings into permanence. The Mission Ranch Inn in Carmel by the Sea, once a decaying relic, was lovingly restored under his own hands. The Tehama Golf Club, carved into the hills above Monterey, became both sanctuary and statement, a symbol of patience rewarded. His ranches stretched across Northern California. His homes stood firm in Bel Air, Sun Valley, and Idaho. Each property wasn't indulgence, it was insurance against ever being powerless again. "I moved my whole life," he said once. "Now I build things that stay." What began as a boy's hunger for stability had turned into a man's empire of stillness. His net worth soared beyond $400 million. But his wealth wasn't measured in money. It was measured in mastery. Behind the camera, he ruled with calm precision. A nod, a pause, a whisper. He didn't shout, he guided. Crew members once said working with him felt like filming inside a heartbeat. Quiet, steady, deliberate. He never wasted words, one cinematographer recalled. Every look meant something. Perhaps it was because words had failed him too many times in his youth. Now, his silence spoke with more authority than any voice in the room. Through that silence, he directed stories of wounded men, haunted souls, stubborn survivors, reflections of himself, reassembled in every frame. And when the lights fade and the reels stop spinning, Clint Eastwood's legacy will not just be counted in Oscars or box office records. It will be counted in what he built, in the acres he restored, the stories he owned, the lives he inspired. His empire was never made of noise. It was built from silence, from hunger, from grit, from the cold nights that once taught him how to survive. The boy who once scraped for change now owned horizons, not out of greed, but gratitude. He didn't chase immortality. He built it, brick by brick, film by film, dollar by dollar, until the man who once slept in his car could stand, unshaken, among the monuments he created and whisper, with quiet triumph, "Nothing moves me anymore, because I finally built what stays." For a man admired by millions, Clint Eastwood's most haunting truth was never about fame. It was about love, and how easily it slipped through his fingers. In 1953, at just 23, when his name meant nothing in Hollywood and his wallet was thinner than his hope, Clint met Maggie Johnson, a poised, intelligent woman who saw not the struggling actor he was, but the man he could become. They met on a blind date, on a soft California night scented with promise. Two strangers sitting in a diner booth that would one day feel like a lifetime ago. Maggie laughed easily. Clint listened more than he spoke. "She was steady," he said later, "when I wasn't." In those early years, they had little more than faith and second-hand furniture. Their first apartment smelled of coffee and wet paint. They ate on folding chairs, sharing one blanket in winter. When Clint couldn't afford roses, he left her a piano note instead, a love song played on borrowed keys. Maggie believed in him when Hollywood didn't. She ironed his shirts before auditions, packed his lunch when he worked digging pools, cleaning airplanes, carrying lumber. Those same hands that would one day hold Oscars once scrubbed oil from steel just to keep the lights on. "We'll make it," Maggie whispered once, "even if it takes a lifetime." For a while, that dream was enough. When Rawhide finally brought him fame in 1959, it should have been their shared victory. But success, like fame, comes wrapped in silence. The nights on set turned into weeks away. Clint's phone calls grew shorter, his voice more distant. Hollywood opened its arms, and Clint began to drift, not toward joy, but away from the stillness that had once grounded him. "Fame doesn't change who you are," he said years later. "It just shows what was already there." What it revealed was a man torn between the safety of home and the hunger of freedom. Maggie stayed, loyal, patient, raising their 2 children, Kyle and Allison, in a home that grew quieter with every year. Kyle found his father's rhythm in jazz. Allison inherited his eye for truth and storytelling. But both grew up learning that in their house, love was real, but presence was rare. Rumors didn't just follow Clint Eastwood. They became the quiet chorus beneath his fame, a sound he could never fully silence. Hollywood whispered his story long before he was ready to face it himself. Names floated through the air like unanswered prayers. Kimber, Scott, Catherine, Francesca, Morgan, Lori. Each name, a life tied to his, yet growing in another home, under another roof. Some bore his features, his eyes, even his silence, but not his name. Some he met later, others he only learned about through letters or chance encounters. It was a mosaic of families scattered by time, by secrecy, by the choices of a man who never stayed in one place long enough to see the cost of his leaving. "Being known," Clint once said, "doesn't mean being understood." Perhaps he wasn't speaking to the public. Perhaps he was speaking to them. Maggie never fought the tabloids or raised her voice. She faced the truth the way she faced everything, quietly, with grace that hurt to witness. She smiled through the flashbulbs, the premieres, the long absences that became the rhythm of her days. There were nights she would hear the phone ring, pause halfway down the hall, and then let it stop, because she already knew it wasn't for her. In private, she carried her heartbreak not as a weapon, but as a habit. Friends recalled how she kept photographs of all the children, even those who weren't hers, tucked in a drawer, because, as she once told a friend, they're all his, and that's part of loving him. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was love that refused to harden. By the late 1970s, that love had worn thin, not shattered, just eroded. The distance between them wasn't silence anymore. It was geography. He was always away, on a set, in another city, in another story. She stayed, folding his shirts long after he'd stopped wearing them, listening to jazz records Kyle loved, reading Allison's scripts by the light of the kitchen lamp. In that house, there were echoes of a family that could have been whole. But fame, like the wind, had carried him too far. And though he had built homes across California, there was one home he never truly managed to build. The one where all his children could sit under the same roof. When they separated, there was no scandal, no shouting, only 2 people who understood that sometimes love can survive everything except time. Their marriage of 3 decades ended in 1984. The settlement, $25 million, was monumental, but the real loss was beyond price. Maggie kept the house, Clint kept the road. The children stayed with her, and Clint, ever the wanderer, built elsewhere. She never spoke ill of him, a family friend said. Not once. That grace became her legacy. For Clint, the silence she left behind was deafening. In the years that followed, his art began to echo what his life had taken. The lonely men, the flawed fathers, the quiet souls who carried guilt like a second skin, they were all fragments of the same man. Tightrope, Unforgiven, Million-Dollar Baby. These weren't just films. They were confessions written in shadow and light. When asked what drove him to direct, he said simply, "I wanted to understand." But what he was really chasing wasn't meaning. It was mercy. "I was always moving forward," he admitted, "but sometimes I wonder what I left behind." By then, he had built an empire, land, films, and legacy worth over $400 million. The Mission Ranch Inn, the Tehama Golf Club, homes from Bel Air to Carmel, all standing like monuments to permanence in a life once defined by motion. But even empires have empty rooms. Avinf, quiet moments. He would glance at old photographs. Maggie's laugh, Kyle as a boy, Allison asleep on his shoulder. Reminders of the home he once had and the man he forgot to be. And that's the cruel symmetry of his life. The same discipline that made him rich also kept him alone. He could rebuild ranches, restore hotels, and direct worlds into existence. But he could never rebuild the trust he lost. In Maggie, he didn't just lose a wife. He lost the last woman who loved him before the world did. And in that loss lies the truest lesson of Clint Eastwood's story. That success, no matter how vast, always charges a price. It's not counted in dollars or awards, but in the hearts you can't buy back, the laughter you'll never hear again, and the home you can't return to, no matter how many you build. If Maggie Johnson was the woman who steadied Clint Eastwood's climb, then Sandra Locke was the one who met him at the summit and watched him begin to fall. She wasn't a fleeting chapter in his legend. She was the flame that illuminated his genius and the wound that would never quite close. When they met in 1972 on the set of The Outlaw Josie Wales, it wasn't a simple attraction. It was two storm fronts colliding, electric, magnetic, and fated to both create and destroy. Clint was still married to Maggie, the woman who had carried him through obscurity, raising Kyle and Allison at home while he juggled the hidden weight of other lives. Kimber, Scott, and Catherine. Children born of paths that rarely intersected. Sandra, too, was married, but her union had long become ceremonial. When they crossed paths, it wasn't scandal. It was inevitability. For 14 years, they became Hollywood's paradox, the perfect couple on screen, and the most fragile behind it. Films like The Gauntlet, Bronco Billy, and Sudden Impact pulsed with the energy of their real lives. Two people fighting to hold on to love that burned hotter than it could sustain. To the public, they were glamour and gold. In private, they were two haunted souls, tangled in the same need, to be understood, to be needed, to not be alone. Sandra later confessed, "He was the love of my life, but also the most painful chapter of it." What began as devotion slowly tightened into dependence. Clint, shaped by a lifetime of control and silence, tried to protect her in the only way he knew, by directing, guiding, deciding. He financed her films, shaped her career, built her homes. To the world, it looked like generosity. To her, it began to feel like a cage. "He was afraid to lose me," she once admitted, "but even more afraid to let me be free." Their love became a mirror, reflecting the fears, regrets, and fragility that neither could escape. Then came the heartbreak, that would echo for decades. 2 pregnancies ended before they became life. Choices made under pressures too great for words. For Sandra, they were not just losses. They were the quiet funerals of the family she had once dreamed of. For Clint, they were decisions born not of cruelty, but of chaos. A desperate attempt to keep control in a world that was slipping from his grasp. Between them grew a silence so heavy, it began to erase them both. She wanted stability. He chased freedom. And the distance between those desires became an ocean no love could bridge. By the late 1980s, Clint had quietly begun a new relationship with actress Frances Fisher. And soon, another daughter, Francesca, was born. When Sandra found out, it shattered her. "It felt like dying with your eyes open," she told a confidant. The home that had once held laughter now echoed with ghosts. What followed wasn't vengeance, it was survival. She filed a lawsuit, not for money, but for acknowledgement. In her filings, she claimed that he had quietly limited her opportunities, closing doors that once welcomed her. Clint settled privately, as he always did, without spectacle. But no agreement could erase what was already carved into both of them. Love turned into loss, passion into silence, trust into memory. Years later, when asked if she still loved him, Sandra paused before whispering, "I kept waiting for him to say he was sorry." The apology never came. When Sandra Locke passed away in 2018, Clint Eastwood said nothing. No flowers, no public statement, just silence. The same silence that had both bound and broken them. But those who knew him well understood. That silence wasn't indifference. It was grief. For a man who had built a career on control, this was the one story he could not direct, the one ending he could not rewrite. He had faced critics, studios, and the passage of time. But not this. Not her absence. In the quiet of his Carmel ranch, he was seen more often alone, staring out over the ocean, where the light fades without noise. "There are ghosts Clint lives with now," one longtime collaborator said softly. "Sandra is one of them. Her laughter still lingers in the halls he restored. Her favorite coffee blend still sits unopened on the counter. Every melody he touches on the piano carries her shadow. For all his wealth, the vast ranches, the sweeping golf courses, the fortune exceeding $400 million, none of it could fill the space she left behind. Because Sandra Locke was never just a chapter in his life, she was the reflection of his humanity, the reminder that love, once lost, can echo louder than applause. And in the silence that followed her passing, Clint Eastwood finally faced his most haunting truth, that the hardest part of loss is not absence. It's knowing you helped create it. When Sandra Locke passed away in 2018, Clint Eastwood said nothing. No statement, no tribute, no flowers, just silence. Deep, deliberate, and deafening. To the world, it might have looked like indifference, but to those who knew him, it was something else entirely. Devastation that words could not carry. For 14 turbulent years, they had shared everything: love and anger, laughter and betrayal, connection and collapse. Her death didn't just close a chapter, it sealed off the last doorway to redemption. For a man who had spent his life mastering silence, this was the one silence that betrayed him. It wasn't strength this time, it was grief. By then, Clint Eastwood had already outlived most of the people who had shaped his story. His parents, mentors, old friends, even the myth of invincibility that had once defined him. But losing Sandra was different. She wasn't merely a former love. She had seen him, the man behind the camera, behind the armor. She had witnessed the side he spent a lifetime trying to control. The temper, the tenderness, the doubt, the longing to be loved without condition. And when she was gone, she took with her the only person who had known the chaos behind his calm. The woman he once tried to forget had become the one he could never stop remembering. Friends say something inside him changed after her passing, subtly but unmistakably. On film sets, he still moved with the same quiet discipline, directing movies like The Mule, Richard Jewell, and Cry Macho. But in the pauses between takes, there were moments when he seemed far away, gazing out at nothing, lost in thoughts no one could reach. His longtime producer once whispered, "There are ghosts Clint lives with now. Sandra is one of them." In the quiet corners of his Carmel estate, the reminders lingered. The faint trace of her perfume in an old sweater, the echo of her laughter in rooms that had long forgotten joy, the worn piano she once leaned against while he played. Ordinary details, yes, but together they became a requiem, a symphony of memory and regret. It wasn't that Clint wished their story had gone differently. It was that he never found the words to say so. Not in person, not with honesty. He had spent decades building walls around his heart, maybe to protect others from his silence, or maybe to protect himself from the weight of guilt. But when she died, those walls cracked beneath the truth he had carried too long. Some apologies come too late to be heard. In a rare, private reflection, he once said, "The hardest thing isn't losing someone, it's knowing you helped push them away." For all the awards, the empires, and the $400 million worth of legacy he built, Clint Eastwood was left facing the same truth as every man: that no amount of wealth can buy back what time and silence have taken. Sandra Locke was never just another chapter in his life. She was the mirror he could never face, and now would never have the chance to. The world may never see a monument in her name, but in every look that lingers in his eyes, in every frame of his later films, her shadow lives on. A quiet reminder that even the strongest men carry their ghosts, not in anger, but in remembrance. In the twilight of his extraordinary life, just when it seemed that Clint Eastwood had finally escaped the long shadows of heartbreak and solitude, she appeared, not as a star, not as a muse, but as a whisper of calm. Her name was Christina Sandera. They met quietly at his Mission Ranch in Carmel by the Sea, sometime in the early 2010s, where she worked as a restaurant hostess. There was nothing cinematic about their beginning. No flashbulbs, no fanfare, just two people crossing paths amid the soft hum of everyday life. By 2014, she had moved into his home, and for the first time in decades, that house, long haunted by memories, absences, and echoes, felt lived in again. Christina was different from the others. She didn't want to fix him or follow him. She didn't need his fame or the power that came with it. What she offered was something he had spent a lifetime searching for: stillness. Her affection was not grand, but constant. Her laughter was not loud, but healing. In her presence, the restless legend of Clint Eastwood seemed to exhale. With her, he once said softly, "I finally stopped chasing ghosts." For nearly a decade, Christina became the quiet rhythm of his days. Cooking meals at sunset, sharing slow walks along the Carmel shore, sitting beside him as he played the piano he once thought he'd never touch again. She didn't remind him of what he had lost. She reminded him of what remained. And for a man who had always stood apart, Christina was the rare soul who stood with him, not for what he represented, but for who he was when the lights went out. But on July 18, 2024, the quiet ended. Christina Sandera passed away at 61 from cardiac complications, her heart, the very thing that had steadied his, giving out without warning. There were no headlines, no tributes on television, no Hollywood procession. Just silence. The same silence Clint Eastwood had spent a lifetime both mastering and fearing. Through a family spokesperson came his only public words. Christina was a lovely, caring woman, and I will miss her very much. For a man who had lived through plane crashes, scandals, and losses too many to count, this one was different. This one left him still. Neighbors noticed the change. The blinds stayed drawn, the piano untouched, the garden untended. A man once known for his command of time now seemed suspended in it. At Christina's private service, held in a small chapel not far from the ocean, Clint stood apart, dressed in black, frail yet unbowed, eyes fixed not on the past, but on the space where she used to be. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. As the final prayer ended, he lingered alone, his weathered hand resting on her urn just a moment longer than the rest. Those nearby said he whispered something, but no one heard what it was. Later, when the housekeeper returned to his home, she found Christina's favorite scarf folded neatly on his chair, her glasses still by the window. Nothing had been moved. Nothing would be. Christina had never sought the spotlight. She was never called wife, never posed beside him on a red carpet. But to Clint, she had been his quiet redemption, the proof that love, even late in life, could still arrive without judgment or demand. In her, he found peace. In losing her, he lost that peace again. Her passing wasn't just the end of companionship, it was the end of sanctuary, the soft, steady harbor that had finally let him feel at home. And now, in the house that overlooks the same Pacific he once fought to survive, Clint Eastwood lives surrounded by silence once more. Not the strong silence of youth, but the fragile silence of absence. The kind that lingers where love used to live. When asked how he's doing, he answers the way only Clint Eastwood could. Now it's quiet again. But those who have heard him say it know that quiet is not peace. It's memory, echoing softly through the walls of a legend who, after a lifetime of building empires, has learned that the one thing even time cannot rebuild is the sound of someone's laughter when it's gone. Over the decades, Clint Eastwood built his cinematic kingdom playing men of principle, lone riders who defended the helpless, who stood firm against chaos, who stared down death with steady eyes. Yet beyond the silver screen, in the quiet hallways of his private life, the greatest role he ever faced wasn't scripted, rehearsed, or directed. It was fatherhood, a role he spent a lifetime trying, and often failing to understand. In his world, silence was affection. Distance was control. He has long been known to have fathered 8 children with 6 women, yet for decades he refused to speak of numbers, as if love could not be measured in headlines. Some children didn't know his face until adulthood. Others grew up under his shadow, but never quite in his arms, separated not by oceans, but by choices, by time, by the echo of a man who kept moving before anyone could reach him. Among them was Laurie Murray, born in the 1950s and adopted soon after. She grew up unaware of her lineage, her life unfolding far from Hollywood's glare. Decades later, when she discovered the truth, that Clint Eastwood was her biological father, she did not react with anger, only quiet awe. It was as if a ghost had walked back into his own story, a family friend recalled, not to demand answers, but to belong. Then came Kimber, born in 1964 from his relationship with Roxanne Tunis, while he was still married to Maggie Johnson, the woman who had once steadied his climb when everything else was uncertain. Maggie would later give him two children of her own. Kyle, born in 1968, who found his father's rhythm in jazz, and Allison, born in 1972, who inherited his eye for direction and storytelling. Yet even as the family tree expanded, the branches rarely touched. Years later came Scott Eastwood, born in 1986 to Jocelyn Reeves, a son whose jawline and steely gaze mirrored his father so hauntingly that fans called him Eastwood Reborn. But as Scott once said with quiet honesty, he didn't make it easy. He made you earn it. Those words weren't bitter. They were tender, layered with understanding. Catherine, Francesca, and Morgan followed, each from different mothers, each another heartbeat in a life lived in chapters, not continuity. To the public, Clint Eastwood was a fortress, wise, unshaken, almost mythic. But to his children, he was something less defined and more human. A man who could build worlds on screen but struggled to build warmth at home. Birthdays passed without calls. Letters stayed unsent. Time drifted. He wasn't cruel, one longtime acquaintance said softly. Just somewhere else. Always somewhere else. In interviews, he spoke of his children sparingly, as if afraid to hold their names too tightly in case they slipped away again. The man who had made audiences weep as fathers on film, protective, wounded, self-sacrificing, often couldn't translate that tenderness into real life. Perhaps it wasn't absence of love, but an absence of language. Some hearts, broken too early, never learn the words for closeness. Now, in the quiet winter of his years, Clint Eastwood lives surrounded not by applause, but by the soft company of his grown children. They visit when they can, gatherings that are small, unannounced, yet full of quiet meaning. A photo emerges here and there. Clint standing beside Scott at a premiere, a faint smile shared with Allison at a charity event, Kyle performing one of his jazz compositions in his father's honor. Behind those captured moments lies something heavier than nostalgia, an unspoken reconciliation, fragile but real. Those close to him say he has grown gentler, slower to judge, quicker to listen. At dinners, he watches faces that mirror his own, strong lines, steady eyes, and perhaps wonders how much of himself they inherited, and how much he still owes them. None of his children speak with resentment. Their words, complicated, private, independent, paint a portrait not of anger, but of quiet acceptance. Clint Eastwood once said, "You can only be young once, but you can be immature forever." It was meant as a joke, but behind it lies the confession of a man who spent decades learning how to show up only after the moment had passed. He gave the world timeless heroes, but to those who bore his name, it was his absence that spoke the loudest. There were no grand reconciliations, no sweeping apologies, just gestures, a dinner invitation, a quiet hug, a nod across a crowded room. For a man who built empires from story and silence, fatherhood became his most honest script. Unfinished, flawed, but true. And perhaps that is where his redemption lies. Because, in the end, even legends must face the most human reckoning of all. That love, once missed, can still be mended. Not through words, but through presence. And maybe that is the legacy Clint Eastwood will leave behind. Not just a fortune of land, films, and fame, but the hard-earned grace of a father still learning how to be one. In the twilight of a life that has already outlasted myth, Clint Eastwood lives not in the noise of fame, but in the hush of endurance. More than 9 decades have passed since that restless boy of the Great Depression swam through the wreckage of a downed plane and the storms of rejection to build one of the most unshakable legacies in Hollywood. Today, What he owns is not measured in gold or applause, but in something rarer: permanence. His fortune, valued around $400 million, is the quiet result of nearly 70 years of relentless work, discipline, and restraint. Every film he directed, every acre he purchased, every home he restored tells a single story of a man who built stability out of uncertainty. Among his proudest creations stands the Mission Ranch Inn in Carmel by the Sea, a property he first saved from demolition in the 1980s. What was once an abandoned relic is now a 22-acre estate of whitewashed cottages, a piano bar, and panoramic views of grazing sheep and the Pacific beyond. A living memory of the America he grew up believing in. He still walks its trails at dawn, where ocean mist and memory meet. Higher in the hills, the gates of his Tehama Golf Club open onto 2,000 acres of rolling wilderness, his private sanctuary in Monterey County. There, modern architecture meets nature's raw edges, and the man who once lived paycheck to paycheck now owns a world measured in sky and silence. His other homes are scattered like chapters of a long life. A Bel Air mansion purchased in the 1990s, minimalist and timeless, where he occasionally hosts family gatherings. A Sun Valley retreat in Idaho, surrounded by snow-dusted pines, where he escapes Hollywood altogether. And the Rising River Ranch, his sprawling Northern California property that once hosted family barbecues and quiet fishing trips. He also owns a discreet oceanfront home in Maui, where the air smells of salt and pine, and where, as neighbors recall, he reads screenplays on the porch with coffee at sunrise. Each property, understated, sturdy, unchanging, reflects the man who built them, grounded, enduring, indifferent to flash. Though his collection is modest compared to many of his peers, it carries his character, a fleet of classic cars that speak more of craftsmanship than luxury. A Gran Torino restored by his own hands, a vintage Lincoln, and a Porsche 911 he drives through Carmel's winding roads with the same deliberate calm he brings to his films. He has no private jet, preferring chartered flights. No super yacht, though he occasionally sails off the California coast with old friends. His indulgence has never been excess, but longevity, choosing what lasts over what shines. For Clint Eastwood, wealth was never about collecting things. It was about reclaiming control. From the boy who once moved from town to town chasing his father's work, to the man who now owns thousands of acres of California soil, every purchase carries a quiet defiance, proof that the ground beneath his feet will never again be taken from him. "I never liked waste," he said once, "but I like things that last." And so, his fortune stands not as a monument to greed, but as an archive of endurance, the material evidence of a life that refused to collapse. But behind every legacy lies complexity, and his is written across generations. Clint Eastwood is the father of 8 children, each with their own lives, talents, and memories of him. Kyle, his eldest son with Maggie Johnson, is now a celebrated jazz musician, soft-spoken and thoughtful, the quiet rhythm to his father's storm. Allison, born in 1972, followed him into the film world, an actress, director, and voice of compassion. Kimber, from his long relationship with Roxanne Tunis, built her own path as a producer and makeup artist, living far from headlines. Then came Scott, son of flight attendant Jocelyn Reeves, now one of Hollywood's rising stars. With his father's steel gaze and discipline, Scott often says, "Dad taught me that nothing worthwhile comes easy." Beside him is his sister Catherine, a writer and actress, Francesca, born to actress Frances Fisher, now a model and filmmaker, Morgan, the youngest daughter of his marriage to journalist Dina Ruiz, who carries the grace of her mother and the spirit of her father. And then there is Laurie Murray, the daughter given up for adoption in the 1950s, who reconnected with Clint decades later. Their reunion was private, free of spectacle, marked not by tears but by quiet recognition. One friend described it simply: "It wasn't about making up for lost years, it was about peace." Together, these 8 names form not a perfect family portrait, but a mosaic, beautiful, uneven, deeply human. They have different mothers, different histories, yet all share fragments of the same man: his quiet, his grit, his need to build. Some remain close, others keep distance. None speak with resentment. "He's complicated," one child once said, "but he's ours." Time has softened what fame once fractured. In recent years, family gatherings have become smaller, simpler. Dinners at Carmel. Birthdays marked not by grandeur, but by presence. For a man who spent his youth running, staying still has become its own form of redemption. Though Eastwood's fortune could fill museums, it is the unseen investments that define him now. He has given millions to environmental conservation, veterans' charities, and arts education, often anonymously. "If you have more than you need," he once told a friend, "you should leave the world better than you found it." There is no publicized foundation, no grand gestures, only quiet giving. As for inheritance, Clint has reportedly placed his assets in trusts designed to preserve family harmony, a reflection of a man who has lived long enough to understand that money divides faster than it unites. His truest legacy, he often says, is not what he built, but what endures. And yet, even surrounded by beauty and comfort, solitude lingers. The Mission Ranch piano still stands in the same corner where he once composed in the dark. The view from his Carmel home stretches endlessly toward the sea, a sea he once swam for his life. Through, a sea that never forgot him. Neighbors describe him now as quiet, gracious, always walking at dawn. No entourage, no spectacle. Just a man who, after a lifetime of motion, seems finally at rest. Those who visit say he still watches the sun sink over the Pacific in silence, as if measuring what remains. Time, memory, gratitude. Clint Eastwood has spent his entire life defining strength for others. Yet his truest strength may be the way he has learned to accept fragility. He has lost lovers, friends, and years he can't reclaim. He has seen his name turned into myth and his image into symbol. But beneath it all remains the same boy who once whispered to himself in the back seat of a cold car that he would never be forgotten. And he never was. He built an empire not of gold, but of endurance. An empire of will, silence, and the simple faith that persistence itself is a kind of immortality. So when you look at Clint Eastwood now, the weathered face, the steady eyes, the quiet beneath the legend, remember this: his story isn't just about cinema or fortune. It's about the price of greatness, the weight of time, and the grace of still being here. If his life or his films have ever moved you, leave a thought, a memory, a tribute below. Because even legends, especially the quiet ones, deserve to know that their echoes still matter.